Harry, we've been talking about how interested Paul is in exceedingly practical, embodied human life, not just in some kind of abstract spiritual realm. And in chapters 5 and 6, to which we now turn, that becomes especially clear. He's worried about issues of sexual morality, and he's worried about the very American issue of how often do you go to court to sue somebody and why. Let's start with the sexual issues. What's got him so
All right. Paul is
riled up? Paul is riled up at the beginning of chapter 5.
Paul is concerned.
Yeah.
That's clear. And we finally have a presenting issue as opposed to the rather generic language about wisdom and apostleship and everything else in the first 4 chapters. And he tells us at the beginning of chapter 5, it is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, of a kind that is not found even among pagans. Maybe, maybe not.
Yeah, but
For a man is living with his father's wife. Now, what's going on here? Probably not incest with his mother.
Not.
Probably,
I think he would have said that straight out. Yeah.
A widow
and been truly
of
annoyed.
his father, second marriage, perhaps. And I think what is motivating Paul's ire here is his Jewish heritage, coming out of a text like Leviticus 18, which stipulates what appropriate sexual behavior is. And Leviticus 18:8 says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is the nakedness of your father." And presumably that's not your mother, specified in another verse.
Right.
Another wife.
Yeah.
So this is a kind of behavior that would be prohibited by Torah.
Yeah.
So despite the fact that Paul will say, and probably has said to the Corinthians, that they are not bound by Jewish Torah, he feels this is a fundamental ethical issue, and you just don't do it. Now, why is it that the Corinthians think they have authorization to do it?
And why do they boast about it?
And
even more bizarrely, I think.
Right. And I think we find the answer to that question in the next chapter after he deals a little bit with the lawsuit issue. But sex is on his mind in both of these chapters, 5 and 6.
In the purest possible way, of course.
Right, of course. Right. But in chapter 6, verse 12, he apparently is quoting a slogan that's current in the Corinthian community. All things are lawful for me. Now, where would they get that idea? Probably from Paul.
Him. Yes, exactly.
So nothing like solutions to create problems. And the solution that Paul has, as you hinted earlier on in one of our conversations, the solution is Paul's gospel. Look, that they have been called to freedom. And this freedom makes all things possible, including dining with Jews and Gentiles. And the Corinthians are hearing this, is that it makes all...
Anything goes.
Anything goes, or something to that effect. So what Paul is fundamentally arguing for here, I think, in chapters 5 and 6 on the issue of sexuality is that judgments about sexual behavior are indeed matters of Christian concern. And as we know, Christians have argued about specific judgments about sexual behavior, and this still is a matter that divides churches. But that Christians should be concerned with it, I think, is a matter beyond dispute. Paul's own sexual morality is coming out of his biblical heritage, and it strongly condemns not only this particular act, but all sorts of other things that he just lists. In chapter 6, verse 9, for instance, fornication and adultery and male prostitution, etc. Or in general, at the end of chapter 6, verses 17, where he talks about fornication, shun it.
And we come back to our temple again.
And there we bring up the temple language and the body language. So Paul wants to insist that sex, like just about everything else that humans engage in, is a matter of appropriate consideration for moral reflection and for reflection within this community.
There is no realm in Paul, and this is one of the things I like about him, that's actually free of responsibility to God. There's not this set of issues that are kind of indifferent in terms of the way he thinks it. I think he thinks that all of creation is being redeemed by God in Jesus Christ, and therefore what we do with all of our creation is a matter of Christian responsibility, not simply of individual choice. That's tough for us, but I think it's important for him.
And using this language of sanctification as a way of getting at that God's will is not only to be in a kind of vague relationship with everybody, but that it's a transformative relationship, a relationship that lends holiness to individuals and to communities. And he's going to insist on this again in chapter 7 when he talks about marriage.
And he wants to preserve the holiness of the community, which brings me to one of my puzzles about this. I've been a pastor of 3 different churches, all of them seeking to be faithful, all of them reading the Bible, all of them reading Paul, all of them worried about sexual ethics because we are in our time. Not once has anybody ever suggested we should ask anybody to leave the church on issues of sexual morality. We think about it in the abstract, but we've never thought it was our job as Christian people to say, no, this has gone too far, out you go. Is there a way that faithful Christian people today can still be worried about church discipline the way he is, or are we simply too
Yeah, well, Paul definitely insists, doesn't he, that the guy who's sleeping with his father's wife is to be expelled.
Yeah, out he goes.
It'd be interesting to know whether the Corinthians took his advice on this point.
Exactly. Or whether the guy repents and comes back, who knows?
Yeah, and there are some hints in 2 Corinthians that there might have been a big blow-up over this.
Indeed.
But Paul certainly wants to draw a boundary here, and this has to do with his notion of sanctification and holiness too. And that might be the downside of using that kind of language, that sanctification and holiness usually is something that takes place within certain set boundaries. And so Paul might not be totally faithful to his own gospel here of extending God's grace to everything, and to the redeeming power of God can be at work. Well, I think Paul does hope that God's redeeming power is going to be involved with this guy.
I think he's not actually condemning this man to hell.
No.
I think he's removing him from church in hopes that he'll repent and come
so that
back.
his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord.
Yeah, I think this is...
But it's a kind of harsh move that most of us would not be content with. Although this raises the larger issue of are there any sorts of ethical issues on which we might want to expel a member of a congregation or take some sort of dramatic action?
The place where I think back to it is in terms of race relations, where I'm now living in the South, and there are courageous pastors who lost their pulpits, and I'm sure there are courageous lay people who lost their status as deacons or elders by their insistence that the church needed to be integrated, and that was seen as violating their sense of the white sanctity of that community, and where lines got drawn. So it's very hard. I'm a star of inclusiveness. I wander around the country talking about the inclusive gospel and getting to great applause, especially from moderates and liberals. But sometimes I have to call my own attention to the fact that Paul says there are lines. It's not true that the sanctity of the church allows just anything.
Right. This comes home to me as a Catholic with all of the problems that the Catholic Church has had in this country over priestly pedophilia and the failure to take action there.
Yeah.
And I think the action of the Church within the last couple of years to insist that
there are lines you can't cross.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly.
It's an appropriate thing to do.
Yep, exactly.
It's a matter of discernment from age to age.
And it's tough. And it's tough.
But it needs to be done.
Lawsuits. If this doesn't go well, I intend to sue you, even though we're both Christians, but it seems to me it'll be entirely your fault. What would Paul think about that?
He would definitely disapprove, quite clearly.
Okay.
He tells us at the beginning of chapter 6 that people ought not be going to courts, that they ought to try to solve their problems within the community. This is one of those cases where I think Paul's advice is utterly unrealistic for our environment, but still advice that we ought to take with some degree of seriousness. I think of a lot of my friends, both in dealing with marital issues or dealing with even questions of civil law, who found mediation a useful and important mechanism. The Christians ought to be thinking about ways in which the adversarial situation of a court might not be the best way to solve a problem, and to look for ways that are compatible with fundamental Christian commitments. I think that's what Paul's message says to me.
No, I think that's important. I think we do have a tendency more than ever in our communities to assume that the solution to any problem is to find someone to blame and then sue as quickly as we can. And in some ways, litigation has taken the place of theology for us. We no longer ask what God's doing. We try to figure out who we can blame and get money out of. And I think in an odd way, Paul, not knowing that world, nonetheless anticipates it and says for Christian people, back off a little bit and see if there aren't other ways that would be faithful that are equally appropriate.
What do you make of Paul's remark, do you not know that we are to judge angels?
I leave that to your extraordinarily great wisdom on this matter. I don't look forward to it. I have a hard enough time judging humans. I suspect when the angel thing comes, I don't think myself. This is one of those moments where we realize that we think we know what Paul's world is like, and we don't really. I mean, it's not the only place in this book where angels pop up in places we wouldn't have expected. In 1 Corinthians 15, people are being baptized for the dead. I mean, we think that he sounds kind of like a rational 21st century Protestant or Roman Catholic, and we kind of know how it works. And then we suddenly realize there's a whole spiritual world out there in which he also lives, and we have hints of it. But the things he gets up and thinks in the morning, we have only hints of. One of them is there are those angels up there. And it's eschatological language again. It's back to being chosen, what you started with. We are the chosen people. We are so chosen that finally we will even be called upon to judge angels. If you're that chosen, you better be saintly, sanctified.
Well, I look forward to our next conversation about angels in chapter 11.
I do too. I don't look forward to my actual judging of the angels, however.